Hi. All right. I do believe we are live. I don't think I've gone live on this system yet before. I'm on a slightly different computer, so I really hope everything's set up properly. I am still a little bit half asleep. It's morning over here in Tokyo, but I hope you guys had a lovely day. This should be the end of the day for those of you in the US and Canada, and it is launch day for the Stygian Collection. So I hope that went really well. I slept for a part of it. Sorry. But I am really excited about today. This is awesome. And thank you so much for showing up. If you're here in chat today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the short story, but I'm also going to talk about short stories in general and my process for writing short stories. Short stories are actually my personal favorite format. They're the thing that I like best to write, not only because they're very rapid and quick, but also because the pacing of them is just really exciting. You get a glimpse of the world, you step into the world enough to experience something amazing, and then you step all the way back. I find that a real rush, and I just absolutely love writing them as well as reading them. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Oh, hi. We have some people in the chat. Hello, Lunatic. And the Stygian Society, they were here earlier. I'm not sure if they're still in the room yet. They might not be. They might have had to go. But welcome. Hi. So right now, oh, by the way, I'm so sorry if you guys can hear the AC. I'm not sure how good the mic on this laptop is going to be picking that up. But it is summer here in Japan, and oh my God. It's all the humidity point yesterday was like 80%, something insane. So it is very, very hot and very humid here. So please, I apologize for fan sounds and things. I'm just trying to keep this room stable. But in addition to the launch of the Stygian collection that happened today is also the 1st of July for y'all, the end of 1st of July. But for anyone who applied to be part of my feedback group, please check your emails, especially those of you watching the replay. Check your email, please. There's information on it. So we're starting feedback, and you guys should have access to a file so you can start reading my novel Project Clockwork and giving me feedback on it. So go ahead and check out that email. If you have trouble accessing any files or anything like that, please let me know ASAP and I can get you alternatives. Okay, Lunatic says it sounds just fine, so that's awesome. Great. Okay. It's really not too loud, honestly. In the States, I'm used to like window ACs that are incredibly loud. And the AC units here in Japan aren't that bad, which is nice. I'm not sure why they're not as loud. They're bigger. You'd think they'd be louder, but no, they're not that bad. Oh, let's take just got the email. Yeah. It should be a fun time. Oh, and again, read your emails, but pretty much I'm also asking for anyone who wants me to do feedback. You guys got to send me that. So make sure you don't forget to do that so I can get started on your project as well. All right, so the short story in the Stygian collection for anyone who is dropping into chat or finds this on replay later, my short story is called The Planter, and it is a story that takes place in a world that I don't specifically say it, but it's kind of implied that's a future and that humans they're still around, but they are less common to find. You won't just bump into one as much, at least in not the area that we see the story taking place in. Two individuals enter into an abandoned home and they are looking for food, and they run into some interesting things in the house that at first look normal, but the more they look at stuff in the house, they realize that whoever was occupying the house previously, not a normal person, and was actually quite a scary individual. So It is an eerie story. It will leave you a little bit unsettled. But what's interesting about this short story that I didn't really fully realize until after, editing had happened, I got accepted into the collection and it's, off to publishing. I didn't fully realize until recently because I was going over like inspiration, like script ideas for my YouTube channel. And I was going over inspiration ideas and whatnot, like where do I get my ideas for my stories? I think someone had a question like that. And I realized that the short story for this collection is one of the oddballs in the work that I've done. And I didn't realize that at the time when I submitted it. I was just like, oh, I think this is kind of like got the right creepy air for what this collection is going for. So I thought it fit the publisher, which it did. But this was a weird one. So how the planter came about was I was actually in a job where it was a contract job. It didn't last for very long. I think mine lasted it was supposed to last 4 to 5 months, but mine lasted 3 months because I'm a little too efficient. I would go in and I would have a set amount of tasks I had to do, such as coding and paperwork and whatnot. And I would get it done way too fast. I would get all my tasks done for the day. And I was finished by 2 o'clock, sometimes 1:30. I'd be finished with all my tasks. And I could only clean and reorganize the office so many times. So I would have hours to just kill that was on the clock. And I was just kind of sitting at front waiting, like if a customer walked in, but most of the time no one walked in because we weren't really a help desk exactly. So I just had time to kill. So I was reading short stories and writing. And it was great. I got a ton of short story writing done during that little job, even though it was so short, because I had the time. So I used it. And the short stories I was reading the most were brought by Ray Bradbury. And honestly, if anyone out there struggles with short story format and you just can't get into the flow of short stories, or you just don't like short stories, I would encourage you to just read a few more. I feel like in university, if you've ever taken a creative course in university, they're quite frustrating, honestly, when you're completely new to it, unless you're good at short stories and or enjoy them naturally, which most people aren't, because most people aren't really introduced to good short stories early on. Novels are more common to find in places like libraries. There are short story collections, but they're just less common. You won't run into them very often. They're not as popular. So as a result, a lot of people don't have a really good repertoire of them. And when they go into university, what they get hit with is a lot of highfalutin stuff, which some of it is good. Yellow wallpaper sets your teeth on edge, but when it comes right down to it, a lot of that stuff is literary fiction, and it's written for a particular vibe and purpose, and it's either going to be your taste or not your taste. And more often than not, myself and a lot of other people found a lot of it to be just meh kind of work. And even when it comes to greats like Ray Bradbury, usually what's required is Fahrenheit 451, which, to be honest, it's not my favorite. It's not my favorite story of his. I feel like a lot of his other short stories are better. You guys need to try, what is the title of it again? I think I wrote it down because I wanted to remember it. Oh, The Long Rain. Oh, God. The Long Rain by Ray Bradbury is one of the most eerie short story. It's a sci-fi short story. It's about some pilots who crash land their spaceship on a planet that rains continuously, and they have to get to a sun dome, which is the only place where the rain stops. And the rain slowly drives them mad as they're traveling this distance to get to the sun dome, right? And it is gorgeous in a scary kind of way. It's so interesting. I think it's a really good showcase of how beautiful genre writing can be while at the same time being scary. And so I really recommend that one. But stuff like that usually isn't in university. That's stuff that I had to read later, years later, at this job at a desk. I was just reading this giant collection of Ray Bradbury short stories, and a lot of them are actually quite amazing. And I really wish they showcased that in university more. Sadly, they don't. Another collection of short stories. I'm just kind of all over the place right now, but on the topic of short stories we love, this collection of short stories is really fantastic. If you love kind of twisted fairy tale, this is Rose and the Beast by Francesca Bloch. This is really great. I know twisted fairy tales, reimagined fairy tales, they're actually relatively common. Lots of people do them with good reason. There are lots of different ways to interpret one story, but these are really fantastic. Like each one of the short stories takes a turn I didn't expect, but makes sense. Like I've read twisted fairy tales before and they can be hit and miss, but this one's pretty consistently good. The short stories are great. They do tend to be on the darker side though, so just a warning, but they are fantastic. So I do recommend that one. Let's see, so I was reading that kind of stuff. Those were the kinds of things I was reading in my free time. And I was writing short stories. And I got to a place where I just wanted a challenge. I was reading so many amazing short stories that I was just wanting something I could sink my teeth into. And I tried looking up prompts online and I just wasn't interested. I was like, no, I need a real challenge. So I actually contacted another writer friend of mine and I asked her for one. I was like, hey, I want to write a short story and I want someone to give me a challenge. I want to be difficult. I don't know, you guys. I had graduated university. I was out of my mind. And I don't know why I wanted to make it hard for myself. But she delivered. She gave me a prompt of a bunch of random items that I had to put into the story. And I couldn't take the cheap way out, which was, just offhandingly describing them and just moving on. They had to be actually incorporated into the story. They actually had to do something within the story. And the thing is, I can't tell you what most of those items are. They're so integrated in the story, I can't find them. I think one of them was the wardrobe, which you do see in the bedroom scene of the short story, that contains some interesting bottles. But I'm not positive because, again, the point was to integrate it so far into the story, it doesn't look like they were oddly placed. Like it has to make sense within the story. But the thing that stuck out, and the items I do remember, are the items that actually created the story, which was unusual because it's not my usual process. And those items were clay pots. Anywhere between 2 to 4 clay pots I had to include in the story. They could be in any condition. I could do anything with them, but they had to be included in the story. And I remember when I was looking at the item list, the reason that stood out so much is it's such a mundane kind of item, but I was just like, what if I toyed with that idea of this very normal item, but making it eerie? And that, of course, prompted, well, how do I make a series of clay pots eerie? How do I make that intimidating anyway? They're clay pots, right? But, I mean, I could break them. I could shatter them. I could chip them. They could be jagged pieces. But I was just like, you can go to a store and find clay pots already jagged and cracked because they crack and break pretty easily. That's not that unusual. So I was looking up, I believe I looked up some pictures of clay pots to kind of get some kind of idea of like, okay, is there any like maybe eerie shape? Then I was like, well, I want them to be easily identifiable by the character as a clay pot. So I don't want to change the shape too much. So that's not going to work. And I realized with looking some pictures, because at the time I wasn't doing a lot of like planting myself. Like I do a little bit more gardening now, but back then I didn't. And so I didn't have a lot of experience, but the pictures online were showing me that some clay pots, they can stain. And depending on the kind of soil you use, they can be stained with different kinds of soils and the pigments within those soils, especially red clay pigments. And like the red clay pigments, they're kind of reddish hue, a rusty hue, right? And I was thinking, what if it was more red though? What if the red was more like blood, for example? And that was like, okay, that's not right. Because it's something like if you saw staining on a clay pot, look like dirt was sitting there, that's one thing. But if you looked closer and that dirt was red, like really red, like edging on purpley hueish red, like stained, that would definitely feel out of place. And at first you wouldn't notice. It wouldn't be something you'd log immediately. It'd be something that as you're looking at it, you'd be like, well, there's something, what? And then you start looking at other things and you're realizing, okay, this house, someone was in this house that was a scary person. And so that's actually where the story came from, which is unusual. So usually what my process is for not just short stories, especially short stories, but also some of my novels as well, is it's actually character first. So usually I have an idea of a character and something they want or need, and that kind of starts first, and then the world starts to bleed out from the character, and I start thinking, what kind of a world would this character inhabit? How does that world look to them, like, etc. This world started with clay pots and bled out to see more of the world. It bled out into the house, into the greenhouse, into the bedroom, into the wardrobe with the bottles. Those are the things that started growing from the pots, and over time the characters infiltrated that space in my brain, which is very unusual because the characters were one of the last things that were created, and that almost never happens for my process. I can't think off the top of my head. I'm sure I have at least one other short story where I've done that, but it's very unusual for me. It's not my usual process. So having a short story where it was world first meant that the characters are really just exploring it. And the way I worked the short story was that anything you glean out of that, yes, the characters have internal stuff going on and there is a small character arc for them, but they're really you in a way, exploring the space and showing you that space. And that is the short story. It's about how eerie and unnerving that space is. And then you leave that space. Even the characters themselves at the end of the story leave that space. So the space is that short story. And that is something I almost never do. It's a very interesting way to do a short story. But I honestly couldn't tell you, like, does this work every time? I don't know. I rarely ever go for that direction where I've created a space first, and then the short story exists in this one space, and then as soon as we leave it, the short story ends. This is one of the very few cases where I do that. This is kind of an unusual circumstance. But looking back at it, I think it's an interesting way to handle short story format, especially if you are newer to it. Because again, like, I wrote this earlier on in my short story journey. This was a couple years ago, back in, I want to say this was 2014, 2015, no, 2015. 2015 was when I wrote this short story. So it's been a while. I mean, I've edited it, of course, and kept it up and made sure it was really nice, but the first draft was done way back when. So I had done a few more short stories at that time, and I was getting into the rhythm of it. So it's not like I'd never done it before, but I was in the rhythm of short stories. But I was still pretty young as an author at the time. I mean, I wasn't an author at the time, I was just a writer. But when I was writing, I think I kind of had to create in my brain these boundaries where the story stopped, so I wouldn't be compelled to make too big of a thing and get us out of the short story realm. And I didn't intentionally necessarily create this boundary to be the space, but that's what I ended up doing. And that might be a good exercise for anyone who wants to practice short story and you're not very good at it yet, or you find it frustrating. Make the space and the exploration of one space the short story boundary. And then once the characters leave that space, the short story has to end. And kind of make the setting in a way a character or something to be explored. That might be one way. I'm not going to say it always works, but it might be worth an experiment if you are newer to short story, because apparently it worked for me. But it's something I probably will experiment more with now that I've been doing short story format for years. But yeah, that's the origin of the planter. It was a very unique short story for me. Lunatic said, is the point of view from the space's perspective? It is not. But that would have been interesting and possibly more eerie, especially considering what the space is. I can imagine that I could have done it from the perspective of whatever was in the house that isn't anymore and passed on, for a ghost, for example, spirits that are trapped there. There are lots of different ways you can explore space in unconventional ways, like from the perspective of the plants or what's left of them in that house. So there are lots of different ways you could go about it. And that would have been an interesting experiment, that's for sure. And it's a really interesting idea. I would definitely play with that concept if you're interested in like trying space first in order to create that boundary for a short story. I think that's a really interesting concept. I think you would have to have some kind of arc or conclusion in order to get that satisfactory ending, though. So whether it could be them observing another character and that character getting an arc and observing the arc from the outside. That's also possible. But yeah, that's how the story kind of became a thing originally. So I'm kind of curious for anyone like watching. We have a couple people watching. If you do short stories, or really, I guess any story, but short stories, I think it's especially true. Like what your process might be if you do character first, world first, because short stories are so brief. At least for me, like my novels, I sit down with a concept and I will actually go over that concept and I'll check, okay, what am I trying to do? What is the character trying to do for like extended period of time, and really look at that. When it comes to my short stories, I usually have an idea and I just sit down and I just punch the idea out right then and there and just create the short story. I don't really create outlines, and I rarely ever have notes for the short stories. It almost never happens. I just go. And the reason for that is because they're just so brief. Usually in my head, I already have an idea of what scene I want to do. And that's the short story, is that scene, because that's what short stories are. They're a scene, and they could be a series of scenes. They're very rapid, but you want to go into the world and come out of the world pretty quickly. And I don't know. I'm not saying you shouldn't plot short stories, but I feel like the temptation to blow it up even bigger and to do more with it, to expand further, is greater if you do an outline. And so you'd be falling into the possible trap of creating a novella instead of a short story because you've just expanded the world a little too much. To be fair, a lot of my short stories could be expanded into full stories. And that's another thing I've heard someone mention. I can't remember who it was. It was a lecture somewhere. And I can't remember if it was at like a Brandon Sanderson one or if it was another author. I can't remember. I watch and listen to lots of creative work on and off, especially on my walks to and from work. So I can't remember who it was, but someone mentioned that short stories should feel like they could be a full story, like a bigger story elsewhere. One person even stated that it should feel as if it's the end of a story or the beginning of someone else's story. And that's what short stories are. They're like a teaser almost. Yet there's something that you still have a satisfactory like twist of some kind within. So there is a twist, there is a smaller arc. So you do get satisfaction in the ending of a short story. That needs to happen as well. It can't just be some cliffhanger. That won't work. But it does need to feel as if there's more of the world out there. There's more that you could explore. There's more that you could do. Because otherwise, readers won't feel as fulfilled because it's not as interesting a character. It's not as interesting of a world. In order for a world and character to be interesting, it would also need to be able to hold its own as a full book. And again, I'm not sure who was talking about that. I know that there was another author mentioning that and going over it either in a lecture, but I just don't remember which. But I think it's a really good point, because when I look at all my short stories, which at this point I have somewhere between 40 or 50 short stories, all of them, every single one of them could be pulled into a full novel length. Now, the reason I choose not to do that is I feel like I just don't necessarily want to be in that world that long. I don't feel it's necessary for me to be in that world that long. There could be bigger, more interesting, more intricate story arcs for these characters, for that world, that could be had in a novel format, but I just not interested in exploring it. Like, it's like, yes, I could take this character further. Yes, I could explore this theme at a grander scale, but I don't need to. I can pull it all the way back. Like the two characters in The Planter, there's a lot of history with them. They've been through a lot. You can kind of tell by how on edge they are. And at the end, that there's hardship as they leave the house. Like they have a hard life and things are not going to be easy for them. And you also know they're like, at least the main character, that she's tormented by what she is. And so I help the characters start to come to certain conclusions or to feel a certain way about the things they saw in that house. So you see a glimmer of maybe moving forward with accepting what they are. And yet at the same time, you don't get an absolute conclusion, and you don't know where they're going. You don't know exactly where they've come from either. You just I have an idea, but you don't know for sure. And that's because that's not what the story's about. The story isn't about what ends up happening to them. The story isn't about where they came from. The story is about, just because someone is human doesn't mean they are humane. And what is human? What is a monster? That theme, that's what is touched upon. And that's what the characters leave with, is that thought of like, but what am I? And so with short stories, that's what you're going for. You're going for the beginning of an idea, the beginning of a theme, and you have enough of a conclusion for satisfying you, but it's not fully wrapped tight, and it's not necessarily supposed to. There's always supposed to be this feeling that there is more, that there has been more in the past of the character, that there will be more for the character in the future. It's just, we're not going to look at that right now, and you're going to step away. It can be a delicate balance, but I feel like if you read a lot of short story, you start to get the flow of it. It sounds harder, I think, than it actually is. When you read enough of it, when you consume enough of it, it does start to come naturally, because it's pretty much a micro of a far larger story. Are any of your stories interconnected? That's a really good question. Most of them are, in a way. So I've made it, whenever I do a short story, I have short stories that are truly fantastical and completely stand on their own. A lot of my fantasy ones are not in the same universe. However, my sci-fi stories, be it short story or novel, are to a certain extent all connected. So if you read The Planter, and if you're going to be reading Project Clockwork, listen, they might be in the same universe, but somewhere different on the timeline of humanity. And I can't tell you much more about that. Mostly because I haven't set it in stone, because it's just a fun thing for my brain to play with. It's not necessary for readers. It's not something that I like intentionally put in my books per se. Like when I sit down to write, like when I wrote Project Clockwork, I didn't sit down saying that, oh, I'm going to create this massive universe that a lot of other sci-fi short stories are going to tie into. I didn't think that. It just kind of ended up happening. I don't know why, but most of my science fictions end up in the same universe in my head. But they're at different points in humanity's timeline. So some of them are early on in scientific advancement, and some of them are thousands, a million year into the future, right? Where humanity has expanded and colonized in like far reaches of the galaxy and has alliances with various alien entities, right? So it depends. It entirely depends. Most of my sci-fi, they're in the same universe, but they're not connected in a way that readers even could pick up on. There are a few short stories that are closer in timeline than others, and so the where the technology is, where humanity is very similar, but others not so much. So one of my short stories, which you guys haven't been able to see because it's not published yet, but it's one of my first earlier short stories, and it's one of my favorites to this day, Ash and Steel. That one is definitely in the exact same universe as Project Clockwork. They are identical universe. And that one is along the similar timeline as well. It's pretty close. I think that one is only 50, 60 years difference, I think. So that's pretty close in the timeline. But that being said, there are no cameos of characters at this time. I haven't done that thing where, you see a character in one short story, or you see a character in Project Clockwork and then you see him like in the distance or meeting another character in a short story. I haven't done that where I've done crossover. I haven't done that. There are a lot of authors that do, including Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury's done it. He had so many short stories. That man was insane. He had hundreds of short stories, and I've read them all. And he had a couple that were in the same universe and same characters, and they were kind of continuations. And they were interesting. So it is something some people do. I haven't done it where it's that obvious. It's just something that, like, in back of my mind, I know that these things are connected, but no one else really knows. But that is a good question, because there are authors that do that. Some authors even connect different genres. I don't know why, but I can't do that. I couldn't connect my science fictions to my fantasies. I'm not sure why, but my brain just doesn't like allow me to do that kind of a crossover. Like, I mean, technically my science fictions have fantasy elements to them, but I don't connect those two worlds. So I wouldn't connect Project Storyweaver, for example, with Project Clockwork, or Project Storyweaver with Ash and Steel. Like, my brain, these are two completely different universes, and they would never touch because the genres are so vastly different. But that's just me. I know some authors who do integrate multiple genres, which kudos if you can do that. I feel like my brain just can't figure out how that works, but some people do manage it. But that's an interesting question. That is an interesting question. I think one of the reasons I do try to be careful, and I don't have guest appearances and things like that, is I do think is a bit of a slippery slope. You need to really make sure that each edition you do stands on its own, and you don't have to have read the other ones, because the joy of a short story is that it stands alone and it's one and done. You go in, you get out, and it's pretty quick. And so you can read something like that in a single sitting really fast, right? So that's the joy of it. So you really don't want to create a situation where someone would feel need to read multiple short stories and to finish them, because the joy of the short story is to read and get out. And it's very rapid. But if they're like, oh, there's a second part 2, oh, like it kind of disrupts that. And at that point, it's like, well, if you wanted to explore that world so badly that and spend that much time in it, then you really should look into maybe making it a novella at that point instead of having the short story. Because if it's going to be a short story, make it a short story. You know, don't try to keep doing part 2, part 3, part 5. If you're doing parts for a short story, at that point I would really look at maybe novella. It's not quite as long as a novel, still shorter, but it gives you more space, so everything's contained. Maybe try that. But yeah, I wouldn't use short story format to do parts to a singular story, and I wouldn't use short story format for having too heavy integration with characters, because you can kind of lose your place where, you know, maybe you didn't read the first short story in that series, or maybe you didn't read the short story where that character was first introduced, but you're just reading a random short story and two characters already know each other, but it's not, it's said in such a way and handled in such a way that you feel like you're missing information. Because with short story, you don't explain everything. Like, I don't explain exactly what happens to the world and why the world is the way it is in the planter. You don't know. And I don't explain everything for the previous resident. Like, those are things you don't know all the information on, but you don't necessarily need to in order to understand what's going on with the characters, what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. So it's like need to know information, right? But when you do integration within works, it is possible you could slip up and accidentally include information that is critical. And then when you reference back to that in a different short story that's integrated, that's trying to call back to it, if someone hasn't read that other story, they're missing information, and it's a different kind. It's not like this information isn't necessary. Now this information is necessary and we're just missing it. So it's different. So I don't think I ever will do a guest appearance. I might allude to something maybe in the background, specifically with Project Clockwork, those characters, because the way the story ends, the way Project Clockwork ends, it's rife for some of those characters being alluded to in conversations with other characters in the same universe if they're close enough on the timeline, because it would be a historically significant thing. But in their world, and I can't say anything else without blowing the ending. So I could see how I can use guest appearance possibly or allude to other characters, but I'm definitely going to be very careful with that, because I never want people to feel like, oh, I have to read this, this, and this in order to get this one reference. I want you to feel like if it's, I want to make the kind of references where if you catch the reference, you caught it, good for you. It's an Easter egg. But if you don't catch it, it doesn't affect you negatively, which I think is how most things should be set up. But unfortunately, that's not always the case, especially if you like look at Marvel, for example. Some of the things they set up at this point, like you have to have the reference to understand. Because there's so many movies down in the cinematic universe, you have to have the reference, which does make it difficult. If someone wants to start getting into the MCU, it's kind of yikes, because there's just so much material at this point that you'd have to go through. It's one of the reasons I've given up. I fell behind a couple movies back, and by a couple movies back, I mean 2 years ago. I fell behind with the movies, and I've just dropped off the face of the map. I have no idea what's going on anymore, and I'm not even going to try, because it's just so much material. And that's kind of the problem with integration, is you can reach a point where you just have too much material, and you're going to get less new readers. And so the only people reading it are people who've already been reading it. And so your readership is going to decrease. You're not going to increase that readership. So it's a cool concept, but I do think like you need to be careful how you integrate for sure. You could accidentally, leave out information without noticing it. And it can be noticeable to the reader, and it can deter them from reading your work. So, yeah. Let's see. Anything I haven't gone over with short stories? I have had short stories where I've started them and then stopped because I realized they needed to be longer format. That short story wasn't the correct format for them. Which is interesting because, like I said, short story should feel like it is a larger story. So that aspect is always to a certain extent there, at least for my short stories. But when it comes to certain ones, I've kind of realized that they need to be a longer size. There's just no way, because what the character is dealing with, I can't do a snapshot of it without, again, leaving out too much information or something. It's not that common. Usually a lot of my stories, I could do a version of a short story and feel pretty satisfied, but some of them, no. Story Weaver is one of them that I initially was going to do more of a short story-ish kind of thing, almost a script. And then I realized as I was like getting into the idea itself that it was just, it wasn't gonna work very well in a shorter format because the kinds of themes that I wanted to work on with the character were just too big. There's just no way. So it needed a longer work. Project Clockwork had to be longer. So all of those, they did not fit in short story format. They're just too massive of an idea. And there was no easy way to do a snapshot without it feeling like I was just leaving off massive amounts of information. So those had to be that way. I don't know if anyone, watching has had that experience. Let me know in the comments. I'm interested to see if you've started a short story, stopped, realized that it was just can't be a short story. I think for a lot of people who aren't used to writing short stories, that happens more frequently. Like it used to happen to me a lot more. I think the most amount of cases where I've had that, where I've had to table something because it had to be a novel and I didn't have a free time to do a new novel, that happened the most to me when I first started getting into writing short stories. That was more common for it to happen. But now, usually when I sit down to write a short story, it is the correct format. It is the format it's supposed to be. And I usually can just finish the whole thing in a single sitting, sometimes 2 days. For the initial draft, editing is a little different. Editing usually takes me about a week to 2 weeks, depending on how long the short story is and what I'm doing in it. Yeah, I've had most of my stuff that has turned into full novels that it could not stay short story. That was earlier on. Once I got used to writing short story, that happened less because I knew what I was looking for. Again, it's kind of practice makes perfect, but it does get easier. I swear it really does get easier over time. The more short stories you make, the more short stories you consume, it will start getting easier and easier each time. So I do recommend just reading a ton of short stories and just keep at it. Again, I think it's really, really fun. I love it. And it's very addicting to finish something the same day as you starting it. It's very addicting to have that, oh, I finished something. It's a great feeling. So I really recommend it if you haven't tried it. But that has happened a couple times. But usually I know whether something can work for which format. But yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to talk about with short stories. Oh, we have a comment. I usually need to over explain and I'm too long-winded to successfully complete a short story. That's what a lot of people who are, that's where I used to be. That's why when I say a lot of people, I'm including myself. I used to be that. I used to think I couldn't do short story, that I was too long-winded and I wasn't capable of doing it. Like Ash and Steel originally ended up a little too long and I kept having to edit back. And that was one of my first short stories I ever done. It was actually the first science fiction I ever wrote as well. And it was short story. So it was really challenging for me back in university. But again, the more I read short stories, where I intentionally would read these large collections of short stories, I would only read short stories for months on end. You get the tone of what you're looking for in your head. and you get a sense of when I'm sitting in a story too long, when I'm going on too long. Like, you'll get that feeling. If you're in short story enough, if you're reading it enough, you get the pacing in your head. And then when you go to write your own, you start feeling like, I'm going too long. And you pull back and you stop and you think, okay, what is the purpose of this short story? What is my character doing? Anything that's not absolutely critical, knife it. So you start getting a sense for it after a while. And you start getting a sense of what kind of a scene or aspect of a story would work for short story format. So when I look at worlds like the Planter's World, like, if I was looking at it from the perspective of writing a novel, if I was looking at it from a full-length novel perspective for that story concept, I probably would have looked at how the characters became the way they are, the characters' origins. Or maybe I would have looked at, where the characters are going after they leave the house. Like, what what is their journey? Like, what is their personal goal? What are they heading to next? And I don't do that in the short story. And the reason I don't do that is because I meant for it to be a short story, and it started with that house. So it had that boundary, that external boundary of once I leave the house, the story ends. The story just ends. And the characters have to leave the house. They have to keep moving. They can't stop moving. So if I was looking at it from a novel perspective, I'm looking at things that are larger ideas. So concepts of what happens to them next, concepts like where are they going? Like, what is their future? Like an end destination. Where are they moving towards? But a short story, you can allude to those kinds of things, but you're looking at it in a micro, like very small. So it's more like, where is this character going right now in this moment, and why? And what is stopping them in this moment from reaching the next step? So my main character in the Planter, why don't they just leave the second they are unnerved? And the reason is because they have an internal struggle that they're dealing with, and it freezes them. And they have to work through that in order to leave that house. So that is their struggle. So you're looking at a struggle that's a lot smaller. Instead of looking in like, what is this character doing? It's like, what is this character feeling right now? And how am I moving them on to the next thing? And we're not going to join them for the next thing. That's their own journey. That's their own story that they will continue, that we don't necessarily get to witness. That's kind of how I've seen it. And again, you get a sense of what you're looking for and how to do that when you consume a lot of short stories. Now, you can do short stories that are for longer chunks of time. That is possible to do. I personally find those difficult to do. Not impossible, but very difficult. Most of my short stories could be considered 1 or 2 scenes in a book, and that's it. And then you pull out. You could do something that lasts a couple days. I've seen some authors do that, but it can be rather tricky because you can fall for this where you're over explaining, you're getting too far into it. And that's because you're spending too much time in that world. So the world expanding beyond the capacity of your short story. Your short story can't keep up with it because it's not built to do that. That's novella territory. So I hope that answered your question. At least from my perspective. Again, everyone's got their own process. So I'm positive there are others. If anyone else wants to answer this, of like how they troubleshoot when they catch themselves like going on too long in a short story, like what your guys' process is for, I'm sure some of you guys might have some tips. So anyone in comments, especially on playback, if you could let this user know your personal strategy, that would be awesome. Because I'm sure some of my viewers have a completely different viewpoint on it. So yeah, good question though. Good. I mean, it wasn't a question, it was a statement, but like, it is like a thing. And like I said, like sometimes you have to explain. Sometimes that story just has to be a lot bigger story. It won't work for short story. Like I said, Project Clockwork, there was just no way that was going to be a short story. Now looking back now that I finished Clockwork, I could see 1 or 2 ways I could have maybe done a short story, maybe. But that's like Size 2020 kind of thing. I know that now because I finished it. But that's the thing. In order for me to get the grasp I needed on those characters in that world, I had to spend that much time in that world. I needed to. But for a lot of the short stories, I don't feel I need to spend that much time within the world. So it's easier to step away because I feel like, okay, I spent the amount of time I needed to spend. Now I can step back. So that's kind of how I've handled it. But again, I'm curious about you guys. This has just been a conversation on short story and like how I've always created it, how I create it so far, my current process. I'm kind of curious about you guys and how you guys do, especially those of you on playback. So how do you create short stories? What is the thing that inspires you to do it? Is it just random inspiration? Do you create character first, world first? What tends to be the thing that happens the most? And how do you keep it to a shorter world? How do you keep from staying too long and going too far and entering the novella territory? How do you keep it confined to short story? Does it come naturally, or is it more difficult to define that boundary within your story? I'm kind of interested to know and hear more about that. But thank you guys so much for joining me on this conversation about short story. I hope you guys like my short story, The Planter, in the Stygian Collection. For more information on it, you can click the link down in the description box. And also you can ask questions in the comments. I am checking them on a semi-regular basis. I'll probably get back to you as soon as I can. So I hope you guys enjoy the short story and the rest of the fantastic stories within the Stygian collection that has been released now. I'm so excited. I'm glad it's finally out in the world. And I hope to have my own copy eventually. I'm in Japan. It's a little tricky. So it might take a while for me to get one. But I hope you guys enjoy the short story. Thank you so much for hanging out. Let's see real quick. Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for showing up, dude. And I hope you all have a fantastic week. Bye. Oh, sorry about that. It's been a while since I've done this one. So stream ending. There it is. I don't have my glasses on. That's why I can't read well. I was like, why can't I see anything? Forgot to put on my glasses this morning. That'd do it. Anyway, thank you guys so much for joining the stream. And again, if you guys have information about how you do short stories, leave them in the comments. I would absolutely love to read them, and I'm sure a lot of other people would too. Thank you so much for coming. Be sure to subscribe for more content. See you next time. Bye. Show.